Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Influencers Project. I'm your host, Craig Reynolds, and with me today is one that has gained fame and fortune through the fantasy leagues, my friend, Mr. JJ Zachariason. JJ, how are you today?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm glad to talk to you.
I'm glad to have you on finally. This has been something I've thought about for quite some time because you've got a very cool backstory as to how you became or how you got to where you are today. My whole process with this is because I've always felt that our influencers are our family, friends, our neighbors, the people that we come in contact with. But when you think of influencer today, you think of social media and you think about the people that you may never ever meet. So I always wonder, are people buying into the person and they're getting help from the person, or are they buying into a lifestyle that they see kind of like advertising? You don't necessarily want the product, but you want the lifestyle that you see in the ad. But your situation is a little bit different because you started out doing something totally different and
Yeah.
then transitioned into this role that you're flat out helping people on a one-to-one basis. But before we get to that, where'd you grow up?
Yeah. So I grew up in a suburb outside of Pittsburgh, just north of Pittsburgh. So went to a pretty big high school there and was a very average kid. Met my wife there in high school though, so that's cool. So yeah,
Awesome.
very average kid. Didn't really have like aspirations per se. Good student, but didn't necessarily from like a job standpoint. A lot of what I did in high school to make money, I was pretty lazy first off, but to make some money, I learned and I taught myself how to build websites and do graphic and web design. So that was sort of like my foundation for when I was going off to school. Then I wanted to get into some sort of field that was either design related and art related that way, or get into like marketing, since there was just a natural tie there. So then I ended up getting into I went for marketing, went to the University of Pittsburgh, and that's sort of the path that I was off to once high school and once school started.
Okay, and then at that same time, though, you were also doing basically a labor of love, paying attention to the fantasy leagues. And was it just football, or were there other leagues that you were interested in, and how did that come about?
Yeah, so when I was probably 14 or 15 years old, started my first fantasy league. It's still going on today. With
Whoa, really?
all my high school buddies. So I'm still the commissioner. So we started back. I mean, this is a long time ago at this point, but the league is still going on. So I took interest in fantasy sports really early on. I just thought it was really fun. I was always the guy and the kid who bought baseball cards and hockey cards and stuff just to like look at the stats on the back, as opposed to like flashing the cards out and saying that I have this rookie card and stuff. I just wanted to look at the stats.
Yeah.
So I was always into the numbers stuff, and numbers in general always came and figuring things out through numbers always came pretty natural to me throughout school and whatnot. So it was a very easy match for me to get into fantasy football. And I was always the guy in the league that took it too seriously. Not to the point of like my friends thought that I needed to get help, but more so, I would get in arguments with my buddies and I would just do research on these meaningless arguments about these players in our league chats and in our message forums and stuff. So I was always really, really into it. It's just that at that time when I was going to school, fantasy football was not a huge industry just yet. It was really when Matthew Berry started to get going a little bit at ESPN was when I was going to college. So it was a thing, and it was becoming bigger, but you couldn't go to school, and you still can, obviously, to go to school to become a fantasy football analyst or anything like that. It's more so it was gaining popularity, it was gaining some traction, but it wasn't there yet to be this like full-blown industry, at least what we see right now.
It's massive. I mean, I've got friends that are in leagues as well, and they're dead serious about it. When the season comes along, they're not really paying attention to the games as much as they're paying attention to their team and their games, and not necessarily like, I grew up in Chicago. I'm a Chicago
Right.
Bears fan, right? I watch the game. I'm not thinking about individual stats as much as I'm watching the game, hoping they do well. But
Right.
fantasy is totally different animal. How do you
Totally.
figure out who to draft? Like what? I don't even. I've never done it, so I have no clue how it all even works.
Yeah, so there's a lot of schools of thought. When fantasy football first started to become a little bit more popular, I'd say like maybe around the 2010 year ish, around then when it really started to boom. There's a lot of pushback by players and by fans saying that it's forcing people to not be these like hardcore fans to their teams and stuff, which I would argue is not a bad thing because fans are so rabid and awful at times.
Yeah, fanatics, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So from that perspective, to me, it wasn't that bad of a thing. But what it's done really is really allowed the average fan to become really, really tied to the sport and really them gaining more and more knowledge about the sport and understanding the sport more and really understanding the nuances of the sport. So, with fantasy, you're way more inclined to study and understand the offensive players more. So quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So the basis is you're fielding a lineup every week with a quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, maybe a flex spot where you can throw a running back or a wide receiver in there, and then sometimes a defense and a kicker, a team defense and then a kicker. And so people will there's different variations, and as the years have gone by, you see crazy variations of what a typical league structure looks like. But then you get points based on how these players are scoring, how many yards they're accumulating. If they find the end zone, you get 6 points for that typically. Some leagues, a lot of leagues now, you get points for every reception a player gets. So essentially, you're just taking all of these data inputs, and you can look at historical data too. And so at this point in my career, I build projections, and I have projections for every single offensive player in the league entering a season, which is just really based on looking at what they've done historically, finding trends that we see with coaches, for instance, offensive coordinator trends. So you can really get deep. It's not just like, I like Julian Edelman, I'm going to draft Julian Edelman. It could be that. But if you want to have an edge and gain an edge on your opponents, you got to be looking at offensive coordinator data and stuff now.
That's so deep into the whole process. We'd go watch the horses run, back in Illinois, and I would pick the horse that was pulling the carriage that had the best looking wheels.
Right.
That's how simple it was. I thought it was a joke, right? But what you're doing is so different.
Yeah, and people still do that. Don't get me wrong. There's still like a very, very large and wide audience of casual fantasy football players. And really what we've seen is, I always think of it as like a marketing funnel almost, or just a funnel in general, where the top of the funnel is the very casual player, and you really are funneling them down to be a more hardcore player and a more, get a more hardcore audience to really interact with the content you're creating, whether that be an article or a podcast, what have you. And so there's still a lot of people that are top of funnel. There's more and more that are entering the space every single year. You can think of your typical office league, where people are playing, and you have people that are super casual with it. But as the years have gone on, people have gotten more and more into it. And all that means is that people are spending more. They're spending more time doing it. They want to be the best. And then there's just leagues everywhere now, and different websites that offer leagues where you can play for a lot of money. And there's high stakes leagues. And then obviously there's different variations that have spun off of the traditional fantasy football league, which I work for FanDuel. And FanDuel is a company that started one of the companies that started the daily fantasy trend, which is a completely different beast than regular season-long fantasy, they call it, where you're drafting a team every year, and that's the team that you stick with. Daily fantasy is you have a salary, and all these players every week have a certain salary associated with them, and you have to keep your lineup under a certain salary cap, and then they still accumulate points the same way that they would in a regular season-long league. But your team, you're drafting a new team and selecting a new team essentially every single week.
To me, what I'm hearing is you've stumbled upon 2 loves: numbers, statistics, right, and sports, and you've brought them together. Like, that to me is a massive influence.
Yeah, I would say so. And the other thing too that I love about the space and the industry is that there's a lot of people that are trying to do this stuff. A lot of people that are creating podcasts and creating content. And what that means is I can put my marketing hat on, because that's what I ended up going to get my degree in, was marketing. I can put my marketing hat on and think of ways to differentiate my content and think of ways to really stand out amongst this audience of people who are doing really good work. And there's a lot. It's insane the amount of, if you just search for fantasy football on Apple Podcasts, you're going to see hundreds to thousands of different podcasts that
Wow.
are associated with fantasy football. And then, there's different content sites and there's content everywhere around the game. And so to me, it's fun too from a more creative and artsy and marketing angle to figure out different pieces of content to create amongst this space that's really saturated.
That's ridiculously fascinating how big it is. I mean, it's funny because there's sometimes that I'll stumble past one of the sports networks on TV, and the whole show is about fantasy.
Yeah.
I'm like, I have to believe that you've been on one of those shows at least once or twice because of what you do. And how many other guys out there do what you do? I mean, it sounds like when you're looking at trends and analysis, you're looking back at their history. And what numbers do you specifically look for that, hey, that's the number I needed to see? That means they're going to be great or they're going to not be so great. Is there a
Yes.
certain parameter that you're searching for?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of different stuff that you really are testing essentially to see what's sticky year over year, and what there's a lot of noise, for instance, from statistically, if you want to get really specific. But like a good example of this is like yards per reception in football, right? So you have a wide receiver that averages 16 yards per reception. It's a pretty high mark. And usually that type of number regresses. There's a lot of regression related to fantasy football analysis. So that's really what I'm looking at daily is what kind of statistics carry over year, and what kind of statistics don't. There's no golden key. There's no like uniform statistic to look at and say this guy's going to be good because of this one statistic. You're really putting all these pieces together, sort of like an investigation, and figuring out, this is what works year over year. So for instance, for wide receivers and running backs, something as simple as volume and running backs seeing rush attempts, wide receivers seeing targets through the air, that is actually more indicative of how a player is going to perform the following year than something like an efficiency metric like yards per reception. So you can throw something like yards per reception out the window, but to me, I still look at something like yards per reception or yards per target, because you're seeing who's going to be worse the next year, who's going to regress, or who's going to be naturally better the next season. So
Now,
to me, it's all about just kind of digging into these different numbers. And I mean, there are thousands of different numbers and different ways that you can sort of take something as mundane as yards, which, a huge issue that I had and what sort of motivated me to get into this more is that the way that statistics, especially in football, are portrayed in the media and online is it's a manly game, and we don't need nerds in the sport and all this. And that's one thing, but also, people talk about how it's an 11 on 11 game. So you can't use data to really, become smarter and make better decisions with football, because it's a lot easier for baseball, for instance, where sabermetrics became a really big deal in baseball early on, because it's a 1-to-1 game. It's a pitcher versus batter game. It's easy to measure. But with football, there's hundreds of different matchups going on throughout a game, right?
Right.
And so
Absolutely.
it's a lot more difficult to measure. But to me, that makes it more intriguing. That makes it more fun, because if you can solve certain questions and answer some questions via data, then you're going to have an edge over your competition.
And now, did you teach yourself this, or did you have a mentor that kind of brought you along?
I taught myself how to do it, really. I mean, it started out where I had a job for about 3.5 years out of school, and I just didn't really love what I was doing. Had a couple jobs, and I didn't really love what I was doing. I was working in advertising, and it was just sort of a soul suck, honestly. It just wasn't really – I wasn't feeling passionate about what I was doing. And I've always been someone, like I said, who I never really – took jobs seriously enough, because I wanted to just figure things out on my own and sort of own things myself, which was good and bad. But for this, I was doing my job, doing my 9 to 5, and then I'd come home and I started one day at work. I just opened up a Word document and I started I was thinking, what can I do with my life that would be somewhat fulfilling, even if it isn't my full-time job? I just need some sort of outlet. And I just really I opened up a Word document and I just started throwing ideas into this Word document, and ended up being some fantasy football thoughts and ideas, because I knew that I had a passion for it, clearly. And I started writing just this. It turned into an ebook. It was called The Late Round Quarterback. And it turned into this ebook, and this is back in 2012, turned into an ebook. And the reason it sort of worked, I sort of combined all of the things that I love, which was the marketing angle, because I was able to design. This is back before like ebooks were as big as they are now, where
Yeah, yeah.
I had to like code and design the ebook to make it responsive on different devices and stuff. But then I was also getting the sports involved and the fantasy football side involved, which was great. So it's kind of combining all of this stuff, but also at the time in the fantasy football landscape, analysts on TV and online were touting this idea that you should be drafting your quarterbacks early in fantasy drafts. But all logic and math, etc., was screaming at you that 2011 was an outlier year. You got to keep drafting your quarterbacks late in your fantasy draft. And so I took all of that and I bottled it to differentiate it, and I made the late round quarterback ebook. And that was a way to easily market it then, because everyone's saying, I'm going to draft these guys early. I'm going to draft these guys early. These guys on TV are telling me to draft them early. And then I come out with an ebook I had no following at the time, but I come out with an ebook that said, no, these are the reasons that you should be drafting it late, and sold some copies of it. I mean, it wasn't anything significant, but sold some copies and got some traction. And that's really how my career ended up starting.
Fascinating. That is so utterly fascinating. On one of my other shows, we discussed about doing what you love. Do what you love and the money will follow, right? And to me, what you just said is exactly that. You go out, you prove yourself by doing something that you love, and if it works, great. But if not, you're still doing what you love,
Yeah.
which to me is what it should be about when you really get down to it.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So now, are you mentoring people now that you're in the position that you're in and trying to guide people? Is there a way that people can get a hold of you if they want to work one-on-one with you? How does that work for you?
Yeah. So, I first got my job about a year after I published the ebook. I got a job with Numberfire, which was an analyst. We were the consumer Moneyball is what we would tell people. So you could go to the site, and you can still do it. You can go to the site, get projections for players and stuff like that, get content. So I was hired to be the editor-in-chief there. And then about 3 years later, I want to say, we got bought by FanDuel, which is where I'm at now. So been with Numberfire now for about 7 years. And throughout that journey, as editor-in-chief, we had no writers on staff, no part-time, no freelancers or anything like that. So I sort of built like a model for us in terms of recruiting people who wanted to write about this stuff. And then, I've worked with so many, hundreds of different writers, usually skewed towards younger people who were in the same position that I was when I was out of school and not really knowing what to do with my life and wanting, getting into something that I wanted to do. So I've been working with a lot of the younger guys. It's been really cool and awesome because some of those, a decent number of them, that when they're at Numberfire, they're not making a salary or anything like that. They're just doing some freelance work for us. But they've gone on to get some full-time jobs within the fantasy industry, which isn't the easiest thing to do because it's not like, it's not massive enough for these content producers to just be doing this for a living. But some of them are doing, some of them have been on ESPN, and they're doing some big stuff. And to me, that's been almost just as rewarding, or if not more, than my own career path to just cultivate this group of people and be with them and see their careers do what they're doing. It's been really, really rewarding and to work with them. So I'm wide open when it comes to people coming to me and asking questions, how to get their name out there, etc. They can just shoot me an email and I usually respond. What the best story actually, just to give you an aside, it's so fun. This one guy, his name's Chris. He emailed, this is when I was like a year in at Numberfire as the editor-in-chief. We wrote an article on Russell Wilson or someone, and this guy responds with an email, and he just tears the article apart, just destroys the article. But his points were so valid, and I emailed him back, and I said, "Come write for the website." Like instead of me like going back, you can trash whatever you want to trash. If you're making valid points, that's all I care about, right?
Right.
And so he comes and he starts writing at Numberfire, and now he's doing it full time, and he's been getting job offers a lot of different places. He's just killing it. And so to me, that's really, in this space and in the industry, it really is true that good work elevates, and it really, the cream does rise to the top. And you can really see that throughout the space where, if people are doing good work, it's going to be found.
Well, it's also kudos to you because you could have taken that feedback from this guy and just been completely defensive. But instead, you're like, hey, hold on a second. We could use you, which is great. It's kind of like the hackers that end up going to work for the companies, right? Because they're like, oh, I know how to break into your system. How about you let me design your system so they can't break into it?
Yeah, I want that dude on my team. It's like whenever you're playing a sport and you see someone against you just dominate you, you want that dude on your team, right?
Absolutely,
That's exactly what it was like. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned an email. What's your email address if someone wants to get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can just email jj@numberfire.com.
Okay.
Yeah,
social
super
medias,
simple.
how anyone reach out? What's your social media stuff?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. Twitter is like my go-to. It's really big in the space. So, I mean, it's big in sports media in general. I'm on Twitter @LateRoundQB. That's a great spot. I mean, I'm on there constantly, tweeting way too much.
I don't necessarily know if that's true or not, but I mean, if you say so.
Yeah,
Well,
lot.
JJ, man, thank you for your time today. This has been fascinating, very enlightening and eye-opening. It's always something that I've thought about doing, but then I get to the point where I'm like, I just want to watch the game. I want to passively watch the game. And I know myself well enough that I would end up losing some of the love for being able to sit back on the couch and yell at the Bears like I do every year.
You'd love it. I'm getting you into it this year.
All right. We'll talk about it. Well,
right.
Thanks for your time, man. You enjoy the rest of your day. If you guys like what you're seeing, please make sure you subscribe or go to Apple Podcasts and you can subscribe there and listen in your car. JJ, be good. I'll talk to you soon, buddy.
Thanks, man.